North of Las Vegas, the city ends more abruptly than you might expect. The crowded streets begin to thin, the casinos and shopping centers fall behind, and the night sky grows darker. The highway continues through broad, dry valleys with low mountain ranges resting along the horizon. Settlements become smaller and farther apart. Radio stations weaken. There are long sections of road where almost nothing moves, apart from an occasional truck and the pale shapes of roadside markers passing through the headlights. Somewhere beyond those mountains is Groom Lake. It is called a lake, although for much of the year it is not a body of water in the familiar sense. It is a wide, flat lake bed, hardened by the Nevada sun. Rain and runoff sometimes cover parts of it with shallow water, but most photographs show an immense, light-colored surface lying between the surrounding hills. Beside it, partly hidden by distance and restricted land, stands the collection of runways, hangars, buildings, and antennae that the world knows as Area 51. The name has gathered so much weight over the years that it no longer sounds like a simple number. It suggests locked doors, unmarked aircraft, and answers kept just out of reach. For some people, it suggests machines that did not begin on Earth. For others, it is shorthand for every secret the United States government has chosen not to explain. But the name itself was ordinary. Area 51 was a designation on a map of the Nevada test site. It was not selected because the number carried any hidden meaning. The place did not begin with a crashed flying saucer or a recovered visitor. It began with a practical problem during the Cold War, and with an aeroplane that the United States was not yet certain it could build. That part of the story is well documented. It survives in official histories, declassified reports, and the memories of people who worked there. And it matters, because the later rumours around Area 51 did not grow around an empty patch of desert. They grew around a place where remarkable things really were being hidden. In the early 1950s, the United States knew far less about the Soviet Union than its leaders were willing to admit in public. The wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union had collapsed into suspicion and the threat of nuclear war. The Soviet state was vast, tightly controlled, and difficult to observe from outside. American officials had fragments from agents, intercepted communications, distant photographs, and defectors. What they lacked was a clear view into the interior of the country. Underestimate Soviet strength, and the United States might be caught unprepared. Overestimate it, and enormous sums could be spent responding to forces that did not exist in the numbers imagined. There were no reconnaissance satellites yet. The first successful American photographic spy satellites were still several years away. In the meantime, the most direct answer was also the most dangerous one. Fly an aeroplane over the Soviet Union and take pictures. Aircraft had already carried out reconnaissance work near and sometimes across Soviet-controlled territory. Those missions were hazardous. Conventional aeroplanes could be intercepted by fighters or reached by anti-aircraft fire. A crew that crossed a border could be killed, captured, or placed at the center of an international crisis. The proposed solution was an aircraft built around altitude rather than armor or weapons. It would carry one pilot and a set of powerful cameras. It would be light, efficient, and capable of flying above 70,000 feet, more than 13 miles over the ground. At that height, Its designers believed it would be beyond the reach of the fighters and missiles then available to the Soviet air defense system. The assumption would not remain true forever. Some officials understood that from the beginning. But even a few years of access to the Soviet interior could answer questions that had troubled Washington since the Cold War began. The aircraft started as a Lockheed proposal known as the CL-282. Its designer was Clarence Leonard Johnson, almost universally known as Kelly Johnson. He was the engineer who led Lockheed's small and unusually independent development group in Burbank, California. The group had acquired the nickname Skunk Works during the Second World War. It was known for working quickly, keeping teams small, and avoiding as much ordinary corporate procedure as possible. The new machine would have an extremely long, narrow wing, more like the wing of a glider than that of a fighter. It would carry no guns. Anything not essential to reaching altitude, remaining there and bringing back photographs was a burden. The Air Force initially turned down the design, but the Central Intelligence Agency saw value in an aircraft operated under civilian rather than openly military control. President Dwight Eisenhower knew that sending it across Soviet territory could provoke a confrontation. Placing the project under the CIA did not remove that risk, but allowed it to be managed with unusual secrecy. Eisenhower approved the joint proposal in November 1954. Inside the CIA, the project received the codename Aquatone. The aircraft itself would eventually be called the U-2. The letter U normally meant utility, an almost comically modest description for a machine intended to photograph the most closely guarded military sites in the Soviet Union. Before that name settled, the early aircraft were often referred to simply as articles. The first was Article 001. The project now had approval, money, and an aircraft taking shape in Burbank. What it did not have was somewhere to test it. Lockheed could not simply roll the new aeroplane onto the runway at a busy airfield. Its long wings and unfamiliar shape would attract attention immediately. Test flights would need a great deal of empty airspace. The pilots needed somewhere to practice without airline crews, local residents, or newspaper photographers watching them. Edwards Air Force Base in California was an obvious center for experimental flying, but it was already home to other test programs and too many people who might notice a strange new aeroplane. The U-2 project needed a place within reach of Lockheed's Burbank plant, but far enough from ordinary life to keep the work out of sight. On the 12th of April, 1955, 4 men flew over Nevada in a small Beechcraft aeroplane to look for one. Among them were Richard Bissell, the CIA official directing the program, Colonel Osmond Ritland, his Air Force deputy, Kelly Johnson, and Lockheed's chief test pilot, Tony LaVie. They examined the dry country around the Atomic Energy Commission's Nevada Proving Ground, where nuclear weapons were being tested. Near the northeastern edge of that territory, they saw Groom Lake. The lakebed offered a vast natural landing surface. Mountains helped separate it from the outside world. The surrounding land was sparsely populated, and the neighboring nuclear test area already possessed some of the strictest security in the country. An old strip nearby had been used when the wider region served as a wartime aerial gunnery range. From the air, the place looked promising. After examining it from the ground, the group agreed that it was almost ideal. There was one administrative problem. Groom Lake lay just outside the boundary controlled by the Atomic Energy Commission. Bissell returned to Washington and asked for the land to be added. The commission agreed, Eisenhower approved the arrangement, and an unremarkable patch of Nevada became part of one of the most closely guarded aviation projects in the United States. The choice of Groom Lake is sometimes described as though the site had been discovered by accident, sitting unknown in the desert until Kelly Johnson looked down from an aeroplane. That is only partly true. The old airstrip was already there, and the wider region had been used by the military. What changed in April 1955 was that a small group of men recognized how well the location suited a new kind of secret. Work began quickly. The first version of the base was nothing like the extensive facility visible in later satellite images. Construction crews put up basic buildings, workshops, and living quarters. They improved the runway and prepared the site to receive aircraft, equipment, and personnel. By July, only a few months after the survey flight, the base was ready for the first stage of testing. Kelly Johnson understood that persuading skilled workers to spend weeks in an isolated desert camp might be difficult. He began calling the place Paradise Ranch. The name was shortened to the ranch, and some of the people assigned there called themselves ranch hands. Paradise Ranch was a sales pitch and not a particularly convincing one. The summer heat could be severe, the accommodation was plain, and nearly everything had to be brought in. Yet the nickname softened the place just enough, making a government test site sound faintly like a private retreat. Groom Lake accumulated other names. Watertown was used for the strip, and Dreamland later became a radio call sign associated with the restricted airspace. Different agencies and different periods used different labels. Years later, outsiders could find several names for the same place and wonder whether they referred to separate facilities. Access to the new base was mainly by air. U-2 components were built in Burbank, separated and carried to Nevada aboard a large transport aircraft, then put back together at Groom Lake. A regular shuttle carried workers and cargo to the ranch. This established a pattern that would continue for decades. Secrecy did not require thousands of people to vanish. It depended on limiting what each person saw, where they could discuss it, and who else was present. Article 001 arrived in pieces. Once assembled, it looked unlike the heavy military aircraft familiar to most observers in the 1950s. Its fuselage was slender. Its wings stretched far to either side, giving it the proportions of a powered sailplane. To save weight, it used an unusual bicycle-style arrangement for its main landing gear, with one set of wheels behind the other along the fuselage. Small removable supports, known as pogos, held up the wings while the aircraft was on the ground and dropped away during takeoff. The design gave the U-2 the performance it needed at altitude, but it also made the aeroplane demanding to handle. It was lightly built and sensitive. The long wing generated lift with remarkable efficiency. That was exactly what the engineers wanted at 70,000 feet, where the air was thin. Close to the ground, the same wing could make the aircraft reluctant to stop flying. The cameras were as important as the aeroplane carrying them. New lenses, lightweight film, and equipment capable of scanning far across the horizon turned each flight path into a long ribbon of detailed intelligence. The public cover connected the aircraft with high-altitude weather research. That explanation was plausible because the U-2 really could contribute to atmospheric research. It simply was not the reason it had been created. At the end of July 1955, Tony Levier began taxi tests on the lakebed. These were meant to show how the aircraft behaved while moving under its own power before anyone attempted a proper flight. On the 1st of August, he accelerated Article 001 to about 70 knots. The U-2 lifted into the air. Levier had not intended to take off. The long wing had done its work sooner and more decisively than expected. With no markings on the pale lakebed to help him judge his height, he tried to settle the aircraft back down. It touched the surface in a slight bank and bounced into the air again. On the next attempt, he brought it down with only minor damage. The first movement of a U-2 through the sky had lasted only moments and had happened by accident. 3 days later, Levier made the first planned test flight. A further demonstration with visiting officials followed 4 days after that. The aeroplane flew, and the central idea behind it appeared sound. For the people at Groom Lake, this was the point at which a hurried construction project became a working test base. The runway had a purpose. The temporary buildings supported a real aircraft. Pilots, engineers, mechanics, camera specialists, security officers, and support crews now had to turn one successful design into a reliable intelligence system. They worked under unusual pressure. The aeroplane had to reach an altitude few pilots had experienced. Its cameras, engine, fuel system, pressure suit, and controls all had to function in extreme cold, far above ordinary civil aviation. A failure over Nevada might cost an aircraft and a life. A failure over Soviet territory might also change international politics. The secrecy around the project was therefore more than habit. American officials believed the U-2's usefulness depended on surprise. If the Soviet Union learned exactly how high it flew, how its missions were planned, and what equipment it carried, work on a defense could be accelerated. Every extra month before that happened gave the United States another opportunity to look into places it could not otherwise see. The strange result was that the aircraft had two very different lives from the beginning. On the ground, it was hidden behind restricted boundaries and misleading names. Its components traveled inside transport planes. Its workers used a private shuttle. Its official explanation involved research and weather. In the air, hiding it was much harder. The U-2 was intended to fly above normal traffic, but it was not invisible. Under the right conditions, sunlight could catch an aircraft at great altitude, while the ground below had already entered evening shadow. To a person looking up, the object might appear as a bright point moving through a part of the sky where aeroplanes were not believed to operate. Radar operators could observe returns at heights that did not fit the performance of any aircraft publicly known to exist. Those sightings would become an important part of the Area 51 story. They would also create a problem for the officials responsible for secrecy. The government could not explain what witnesses were seeing without revealing the very program it was trying to protect. For the moment, however, the rumors remained outside the fence. At Groom Lake in the late summer of 1955, there were no crowds gathered on distant public land and no souvenir shops selling pictures of green visitors. There was a new runway, a collection of plain buildings, and an aircraft so secret that even its modest name concealed its purpose. Area 51 had begun not as the home of an established legend, but as a workshop. The people who built it were preparing to send a camera higher than any sustained reconnaissance mission had gone before. They did not know how long their advantage would last, or how quickly Soviet radar and missiles would improve. Nor could they know that the measures used to hide their work would eventually make the location famous around the world. First, though, they had to teach the U-2 to fly at the edge of its narrow limits, and then send it across borders where it was never supposed to be seen.